Hello and welcome back to another Pleb's Perspective. In this video we're going to go over what is an ARPG. At first I was going to make a video regarding whether or not you should choose Diablo 4 Path of Exile as your next ARPG, or if you're new to the genre, just the ARPG that you might want to stick with. However, if you are new to the genre, I figured an explanation as to what is an ARPG would actually be a little bit helpful before diving into which game to play. So ARPG stands for Action Role-Playing Game. Here are some examples of ARPGs outside of Diablo 4 and Path of Exile: Minecraft Dungeons, Last Epoch, Grim Dawn, Lost Ark, Wolcen, Lords of Mayhem. These games are primarily isometric or top-down view, which is the more traditional sense of what an ARPG is. However, there are games that are non-isometric or non-traditional in some sense that are classified as ARPGs because they have aspects of the genre embedded into the game. A list of these games are as follows: Destiny 2 or the Destiny games, the Division games, Outriders, Warframe, V Rising, and Pixel Privateers. Now you might be thinking, what is the common denominator between the games on both of these lists? Well, loot is the main thing that ties these games together, and if it's not loot, it's some form of skills or skill trees that enhance and customize your play style. These elements are what make games some form of ARPG, and you can see, just like any other genre, ARPGs can be blended in to make its own genre. So for an example, with V Rising, that is an ARPG survival game, or in the case of like Destiny, you have a looter shooter, what we know as looter shooters. Those are ARPGs as well. So, and really quick point of clarification, the games are just examples, they are not recommendations. I don't want you to look at this video and be like, oh, you listed this off, so that means it's a good game. I'm not saying that. I haven't played every game on the list, it's just examples. For this video, we're going to focus on the traditional concept of what an ARPG is and what they typically, but not always, but typically consist of. ARPGs allow you to live a power fantasy that is different from your standard super soldier or special agent going behind enemy lines, executing the one target or finding that one piece of intel and then extracting while the enemy is none the wiser. ARPGs give you the ability to be immersed in a world of exploration, fighting off mob after mob of various enemies, and also confronting enemies that are massive in scale that make your character feel dwarfed by comparison, giving a real David versus Goliath sort of feel, where you're such a small being compared to this massive monstrosity, but you could dish out so much damage that you eventually take it down. You'll have an assortment of skills to choose from, either by finding them, like in Path of Exile where they use skill gems, or they're unlockable through skill points like in Diablo. These can then be further upgraded, enhanced in some way, or completely modified to change up their playstyle. This happens through finding items and or through allocating skill points on your skill tree. These skills will clearly outline your strengths and your weaknesses. It's usually very hard to have your skills be set up in such a way that give you crazy versatility. For example, you can focus on being a lightning mage and you have the ability to electrocute and shock your enemies. What happens when you go up against lightning resistant enemies or shock resistant enemies? Naturally, that will be a little bit of a tougher fight for you. This is where planning and strategy comes in. I also want to talk about ailments because ailments are a huge thing in ARPGs. So shock, like I just mentioned, is an ailment or a status effect in Path of Exile. This status effect is associated with lightning that causes the affected target to suffer increased damage from all sources. There are many different elements or status effects, if you prefer, in ARPGs, and all creatures can be resistant. It's not mutually exclusive to what zone they're in. A few of the most common forms of elements are things such as poisons, which cause damage over time, slows, which slow your movement speed and can affect your attack speed, freeze, as the name states, freezes you in place and you're unable to act in most cases. There are plenty more of these, and the effects can vary from game to game. Regarding zones, these are the locations within the game that are unique from one another and typically have a focus of some sort, usually regarding the types of enemies you face as well as the type of damage that they deal. An example here would be in a snow region, you would face enemies that use cold as part of their main effect, while also having the bigger potential of being cold resistant or freeze immune or cold immune, whatever, something like that. If you go into the sewers or somewhere that is actually disgusting, there's a higher likelihood that you'll face off against enemies that use poison or some other sort of damage over time effect on you, while also being potentially poison resistant. There are a multitude of ways for you to approach each zone, and depending on your level and overall setup, the chances of your survival can vary greatly. I want to be clear though, this is just giving you a general sense of what you can expect, as there are many exceptions to this. Now, let's get into the itemization and loot in general. We all love finding shiny items, no matter the game. In RPGs, the items are an extremely important part of your build and playstyle. These items can vary drastically for you, being either really good or really bad. So much so that you may end up changing your entire build and playstyle just based off of the item that you get. There are respecialization or respec costs to change your skills around and whatnot, and that varies greatly from game to game, and the higher level you are, typically the more expensive it is, so you really got to figure out whether it's worth it or not. That's a whole, each game has their own thing, so I'm not really going to dive into that too much here. In Path of Exile, I was using a skill. I found a skill gem early on that's called Cobra Lash, which is, you throw a projectile, it bounces around, adds poison to enemies, and it does a good amount of damage early on. But I had since found a skill called Frost Blades, and it just felt so good to use compared to Cobra Lash. I'm wiping out enemies left and right with this thing a lot faster than with Cobra Lash. It just fits now, like, better for what I'm doing. With that said, I had to move around some items that I was using for Cobra Lash and then start to readjust some things to double down on the cold damage that Frostblade was doing, while also trying to implement the poisons that I had built in my skill tree, which we'll get skill trees here in a second. So I had to like modify some things, and it took a minute, but I feel like I'm in a decent spot with it now. That is probably the quickest and most straightforward example I could give without really getting into the weeds of this, because this shit, it's extremely complex, especially in games like Path of Exile, but just ARPGs in general, it could get pretty complex just even with the simpler games. And even with that, even though Frostblades feels really good right now, there is a high chance that I could find something later on down the line that completely shifts my playstyle and say, oh shit, instead of doing this sounds really good for me, but now I have to decide if this respec cost is going to be worth it. There's a lot of thought. Your decisions can be really meaningful and impactful, especially later on in the game. Back to the items. Items typically are tiered, where you have white, gray items being just whatever, they're just there, they don't really do much. Later on, you start finding blue items or green items in some games, which indicate uncommon or magic items. Colors wise goes is white, blue, and or green for uncommon. Sometimes there's even depending on the game, green will be before blue. Then you have yellow items, which are rare, orange items, which are legendary, and then typically there's another item above all that is considered unique. And depending on the game, these colors change. Sometimes purple is the legendary or purple is unique. Each game is different, so just be mindful of that. What I'm saying here is just a guide. It's not the hard fast rule for everything in ARPGs, just to give you an idea. And on the note of uniques specifically, these can be absolutely build defining, playstyle defining. Like, it makes or breaks whatever it is you're doing. One unique for one person could take them over that plateau of power and bring them way up. Or that unique might as well be a white item, because it doesn't fit what you need to do. It does not match your playstyle. It doesn't do anything for you, so you just stash it away, and maybe you could use it with another character later. They usually have stories to them as well. Sometimes they have a paragraph stating something like with this example from Path of Exile. Yeah, they're pretty hard to get. They either massively help or they don't do shit for you. So now, as far as the difference in rarities, typically the higher the rarity of item, the better. But like I just said, this isn't a hard and fast rule. It's a guide. There are many exceptions to this, where you might find a rare and take that over a legendary, or you might find a legendary and take it over a unique. It really depends on what best fits you. Can you do something with the item later on to work it into your playstyle? There's a lot of factors involved. Each game would literally need its own breakdown to describe what is best for this item, for this build, so on and so forth. Yeah. Lastly, we'll talk about skills and skill trees. Each game has a set of skills. As I mentioned previously, you unlock them either through finding them, like in Path of Exile, or you unlock them through the skill tree. That's just a quick rundown of how you get skills. Now, how to improve skills, you use a skill tree. All of these games in the traditional sense have a skill tree of some sort. They generally offer different types of buffs and bonuses available to you, which can be on the more simpler side of things or the more complex side of things, depending on how the devs want to do things. This is one skill tree of about 3 or so in the game. With all that said, it's kind of hard to talk about skill trees in a general sense because each game does things a little bit differently, and these differences really impact how you play the game. The only thing that I can really say that fits all of them is that you level up, get skill points, and you allocate them on the skill tree to get stronger in some way. And another thing is that the skill trees in and of themselves aren't the main thing that is build defining. What is far more impactful is the items. Those are far more build defining than the skills that you set up on your skill tree. With that said, going into the skill trees is tough, and each game would literally warrant its own video. I don't know if I'll do that, but I mean, I guess if that's something that you want to see from a pleb's perspective, if you want the gist of it, maybe I could do that. Let me know in the comments below. All that said, I really hope this video helps you out to understand what an ARPG is in a general sense. And if you stuck around until now, please like the video, maybe subscribe. Let me know if it did, or if you have any questions or feedback for me. I'd love to hear it. As always, have a great one, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace out.